Okay, thank you, Andrea, and thank you very much for inviting me today to give this seminar. As Andrea's just said, I've been working for some years on the sort of marine record of volcanic processes. First got interested in this when I was working at Southampton. And that first work actually was on the island of Montserrat, so I will come back to some of that work in today's talk. I'm going to be talking less about hazards today, and more specifically about what we can infer from the sedimentary record of events around volcanic islands. And the types of events that I want to focus on are particularly the large-scale lateral collapses of volcanic islands. What we can learn about those processes from looking at the marine sedimentary record of these events, and what we've learned as well about how these events behave when they interact with the seafloor around volcanic islands. So I'm going to be talking principally about three settings: Montserrat, Ritter Island, and Anak, Krakatau. These are places that I have studied, and two of them include some of the best studied historical examples of flank collapse at Ritter and Anak, Krakatau. So in this picture here, actually, we have a German research ship, and I was on this research vessel at the time, and we were surveying the Ritter flank collapse. So in the background there, you can see the remnants of Ritter Island, and I'll go on to talk about that in a few slides' time. So first of all, what I want to, there we are. What I want to do is just briefly introduce this topic of flank collapse and emphasize that these are highly significant events in the morphology of volcanic structures. This is most obvious perhaps from subaerial volcanoes. So an example like the Mount St. Helens collapse in 1980 really brought to the fore the significance of these events in terms of the lifetime of a magmatic system, influences on the subsequent development of that magma system, but of course on the morphology of the volcano itself and on the distribution of material around the surrounding environment. So in this particular example, we can see that Mount St. Helens has lost a lot of height, and the products of this collapse have been distributed over distances of many tens of kilometers away from the volcano in an instantaneous event. So these are major geological processes that reshape volcanic landforms, and this occurs on island settings as well as on subaerial volcanoes. So this is a cross-section through the Mount St. Helens collapse, and you can see that this cuts deeply into the edifice and removes several cubic kilometers in some cases of material. Now in island settings we can actually scale these up, and on large island structures we can see events involving tens, even hundreds or more of cubic kilometers of rock. Now these types of processes are widespread. We see evidence for them in volcanic landforms across all types of tectonic setting. And so if we then look offshore, there are well-known examples that have been mapped offshore island groups like Hawaii and the Canary Islands. So we can see some examples here in the Canaries with the fan of debris off the island of Veliero, for example, here, dispersed for 60 to 80 kilometers in this instance. And if we look around the other Canary Islands, you can see that there are many more of these deposits. So although these are infrequent events, they are an important part of the shaping of these islands, and very significant in terms of the transport of volcaniclastic material into the surrounding seafloor. So these are just some examples again of past events of this type. We've got Mount St. Helens on the top left here, and this is in fact Ritter Island on the top right. And you can see that morphologically, this is very similar to the Mount St. Helens collapse, except most of it is obscured beneath sea level. So it's not obvious to us just from looking at the subaerial structure. But this volcanic landform builds up from around 1,000 meters beneath sea level. So it's a relatively large structure. We can see that it's cut by a horseshoe-shaped collapse around 2 kilometers across. And this is the event that happened in 1888, reshaping this system. But as you can see from the cross sections at the bottom, this is in fact a relatively small event in a geological context compared to some of the larger volcanic structures. So the volumes of these events can become quite extreme and become among the most significant and largest volume sediment transport events on the planet at the larger end of the scale. Now, those very largest events are, of course, less frequent, and I'll be focusing on rather smaller events today. We have knowledge of and have identified these types of deposits offshore many volcanoes in all tectonic settings, and this is shown on this global map here. Essentially, when one studies a volcano and starts to look for evidence of these types of processes, there is generally evidence that these types of instabilities have developed, and they are a typical part of the life cycle of volcanic structures. So the graph at the base just gives you an idea of the types of volumes, and you can see that these very extreme events, although they might be of interest certainly in terms of their scale, what is much more typical is events on the order of 1 to 10 cubic kilometers. So we'll start looking at Montserrat, and this is a map offshore Montserrat based on work that we did from 2010 onwards. And this actually built on previous work that has identified offshore Montserrat the presence of several fan-like piles of debris that were linked to previous collapses of the island. Now, if you look at the subaerial island, you can see there's actually little clear evidence of these major collapses, but when we start to look offshore, there are structures in the submerged flank of the island. And when we start to use geophysical data, so seismic reflection imaging, to probe beneath the seabed, we can see actually that there's a whole stack of these types of deposits which record previous episodes of failure. Now, these occupy a range of dimensions and volumes, and some are more complex than others in terms of how they interact with the seafloor. So some form a relatively simple spreading fan, whereas some, such as this event outlined in green, travel much further and are morphologically more varied, with parts that are blocky and parts that are much more smooth surfaced. And this reflects their interaction with pre-existing seabed sediment. Now, we know this from the seismic reflection imaging through these deposits. So this now gives you a view of that sort of stacked series of landslide deposits. And you can see at the surface, this is that fan-like body of debris in yellow. That green deposit is in fact this one that's mapped here, running right out in the green. And you can see that while parts of this are blocky, the outermost parts of this actually have two fairly parallel upper and lower surfaces. And parts of this record remobilization of in situ seafloor sediment rather than material derived directly from the landslide itself. So many of these events appear to transition to bulk in volume very substantially through their interaction with poorly consolidated seafloor sediments. When we look at that in detail, this is some higher resolution imaging of the internal structures. You can see that parts of these deposits, although they might look seismically transparent or chaotic in lower resolution data, when we look in high resolution, we can see that parts of them simply comprise disturbed zones of seafloor sediment. So volumetrically, you could consider this part of the landslide event, but this is not material derived directly from the volcano. It is a consequence of disturbance of the seafloor triggered by the primary landslide emplacement. So you can see here sort of isolated remnants of in situ seabed material, an overrunning deposit which might have precipitated the underlying deformation, and we can see evidence of sort of folding and thrusting in places as well, which is the style of deformation. So we tried to bring this sort of model together from our observations at Montserrat, and you can see the sort of sequence of processes, if you like, captured here. The idea of an initial event that may both override but also plow into the seabed, and this triggers a forward propagating failure of the pre-existing seafloor sediment, which might be enhanced by the overriding of a debris flow deposit, as shown here. Now, we've since found evidence of this in other settings, as I'll go on to show when we look at Ritter Island. Now, Ritter is a relatively sort of small volcanic island in the Bismarck Arc north of the island of New Guinea, as you can see on the regional map here. It was better known in the 1800s, the site of fairly frequent subaerial eruptions, but in 1888, nearly all of that island disappeared in a single catastrophic collapse. So we can see evidence of that in the top right. This is a drawing of the island as it formerly appeared, and this is an effort to fit the remnants of the island to what was originally present. This subaerial view, I think, gives you an idea of that former island shape. You can see the outer slope of the volcano, which would have previously gone to a peak that's thought to have been about 700 or 800 meters above sea level. All of that has gone, so all that is left is this crescent-shaped remnant of the subaerial island. But as you saw on that earlier image, that bathymetric map, this is just the peak of a much bigger submarine volcanic structure. Now, this collapse was around maybe as much as 5 cubic kilometers, maybe a bit less than that. But nevertheless, that makes it around the size of the Mount St. Helens failure to perhaps slightly larger, and perhaps up to around 10 times the volume of the Anak Krakatau collapse in 2018. Now, the deposits from Ritter extend for over 80 kilometers on the seabed. So this is an extremely extensive series of mass flow deposits that were initiated by this collapse. It's also generated a highly damaging tsunami that was caused impacts on a regional scale. Now, we know these deposits are dispersed for 80 kilometers from, again, seabed mapping and seismic reflection data sets. Now, actually, this is, again, a highly complex deposit, and that's really what we've found in all these sites that we've studied, that the interaction with the seafloor can result in a complex sequence of events initiated by this failure. So in the area around Ritter, which is shown in this bottom left here, the proximal facies, what we see is, first of all, some very large remnants of the failed volcano itself, so material that has not disaggregated. And then the rest of this proximal facies is actually dominated by deformed pre-existing seafloor sediment, which is also deeply incised. And we've attributed a lot of that erosion and incision to the failure event itself, to a very mobile, disintegrating mass movement that actually cut into the deforming seabed in this region. And much of that material then appears to have traveled through this constriction here and is dispersed over this area here as a series of debris flow facies deposits. Now, again, this can be seen from internal imaging. So this image here is actually from that proximal basin, where there's evidence of a thick package of deformed but stratified pre-existing seafloor material. And then beyond that, not very clear at the resolution of this image, but beyond that we see a relatively thin deposit that's dispersed over a large area, and then with turbidite deposits extending beyond those to at least a distance of 80 kilometers. So some of these distal deposits are actually more clearly imaged in this parasound data. And here the 1888 deposit is a transparent deposit above the seabed. Now, if you just focus on the red line, you can see that the base of this deposit was erosive. So it's cutting into pre-existing bedded sediment. And then later phases of this are depositional and forming this this sort of mounded irregular deposit here, these lobes of debris. And then beyond the distal margin of that extend turbidite deposits, which go right down to the margin of this basin and beyond. So this sort of sequence of events is summarized here with a proximal deformation, then actually a region where the event was largely erosive, and then deposition in this distal area. So this is a highly complex event, and actually the total volume of the deposits is much larger than the initial volume of the collapse, and full reconstruction requires geophysical data sets to properly understand the event. Now, just as a note, what we also discovered when we were performing this work was actually beneath the 1888 landslide deposit were remnants of older and in fact much larger mass movements buried within the seafloor sedimentary package. So these SLD 1 and 2 deposits actually originate from a nearby island called Sakar, and they preserve, particularly the lower one, very, very similar structures to what we saw offshore Montserrat. So folding and thrusting, maybe not so clear at this scale, but at the toe of this deposit, there's clear evidence of compressional structures in a thick package of pre-existing seafloor sediment. Now, Ritter was not a particularly large volcano. It was dominated by mafic volcanism. This is an image of the scar, the subaerial remnants of Ritter. We can see interbedded scoria and lava deposits. Now, in terms of that broad structure, that's actually quite similar to the Anak Krakatau island, which is now the one I'm going to turn to. So this is maybe the best known island collapse. It occurred only a bit over 3 years ago in December 2018. Now, the whole island of Anak Krakatau has grown up since about 1927, which is when activity was first observed subaerially here. And this is the sort of ongoing activity linked to the 1883 well-known eruption of Krakatau. So we can see here that it's an island comprised of both scoria deposits overlain by a subaerial pyroclastic cone and lava flows. And this is, in fact, an inherently unstable structure because of the situation in which it is located. So first of all, let's just see what happened in this event. This is a SAR image from summer 2018. We can see the island as it looked on that previous slide. And then in December, this is a couple of days after the collapse, we can see that around half of the area of that subaerial island has been lost in a single catastrophic episode. This cuts beneath sea level, and all of that material has been dispersed to the southwest. Now, as I say, this island originated in the 1920s in the Krakatau caldera, building up on a scarp left from the caldera-forming 1883 eruption. So the early parts of the structure were built by this phreatomagmatic activity, as you can see in these pictures here. Now, to understand that instability, actually, and the dynamic nature of this setting, you do need to go back to 1883. So this is Krakatau as it looked before the catastrophic 1883 eruption. It was erupting since May 1883 along a series of aligned vents, shown in red here. And then all of this northern part of the island, this sort of northern 2/3, disappeared in the culminating August the 27th eruption. So that what was left after this point is just the southern remnant of this island and some relatively deep seafloor, which was part of the caldera subsidence structure. Incidentally, there's also a large volume of material that was dispersed to the north, which is the ignimbrite deposit from that event. So that actually led to a shallower seafloor here and enlarged these islands. So we've got a complex series of processes there occurring in 1883. And then Anak Krakatau built up on the same vent alignment, so more or less in the position where D is marked here, and on the edge of the caldera scarp. So we can see now from this bathymetric map why the situation of Anak Krakatau was unstable. So it's utilizing that same magma pathway and growing on the edge of this caldera scarp. So what happened in 2018 is the southwestern part, the part that was perched on the caldera margin, failed and was transported to the southwest. Now, what you can see, might be slightly confusing. What this island actually shows is the bathymetry, the topography of Anak Krakatau in January 2019, when it had already regrown to some extent. So all of this is actually new material So although the island failure scar was about here, it then rapidly redeveloped through vigorous activity. But the deposits from the 2018 collapse is this mounded region here. So if we look at these now obliquely from the seafloor, you can see that actually this failure was not particularly disintegrative. It didn't break up to a large extent. Very large blocks are well preserved on the seafloor, which show the fragmentation of this island mass. Again, seismic reflection imaging helps us understand this a little more. And it's quite remarkable actually how deeply buried this deposit already was within less than a year after the event. And this is a consequence of that vigorous post-collapse eruptive activity. So all of those eruptive products that rebuilt the island also buried to quite some extent. So this is between the green and the blue lines. That's the burial of the 2018 collapse deposit. But nevertheless, it's still visible at the seafloor and includes some very large blocks, as well as a sort of tapering deposits ahead of that from more mobile material. So a similar pattern to what we see at Ritter and elsewhere, although this actually didn't break up to as much an extent. Now, that's used my 20 minutes, but hopefully I've sort of introduced the topic there and given some insights into the types of processes that are ubiquitous around volcanic islands, and that with high resolution mapping and particularly seismic reflection data sets that we can better understand. So just to summarize a few points, in addition to background sedimentation processes, volcanic islands are prone to these major events which deliver very large volumes of sediments in a very short time scale to the surrounding seafloor. So although these are infrequent events, on a geological timescale, they're still a substantial part of the sediment accumulation in adjacent basins, as you can hopefully see from some of those seismic reflection profiles. What we see when we look at these is evidence of complex seafloor interactions. So the volume of the deposit is not a simple reflection of the volume of the primary collapse, and that's because these collapses trigger secondary flows, secondary deformation of the seabed that can extend in some cases for many tens of kilometers beyond the island site. Subsequent volcanic activity can be very vigorous, perhaps initiated by these failures. And this means these deposits can be prone to relatively rapid burial, and they're not necessarily easy to recognize by seabed mapping alone. And therefore, geophysical imaging is key to really understand the processes involved in these large-scale events. Okay, I will stop there so that we can move on to any questions and discussion. Thank you.